So I need a pool cue rack. Well, I guess I don't need it. My parents need it. So my parents recently just had their basement remodeled, and part of that remodel was getting this pool table. Now, the billiard set that came with this pool table also came with this pool cue rack, which is nice of them, but there are a couple of problems with it. One is that they don't exactly look that great. Just two pieces of wood painted black with some holes for the mounting hardware that leaves whatever screw head you use exposed. I don't know, not the most elegant display solution. And two, this rack doesn't have a space to put in any of the other accessories that come with the rest of the billiard set. This box with the cue repair stuff, as well as the chalk, the two brushes for cleaning the felt, and the two ball racks. Some pool tables have a hook underneath to hang the racks, but no such luck on this table. There also needs to be a place to put this honkin' thing. Now this thing is specific only to this pool table, and that's because this is actually a wrench for this gigantic nut. There's this giant pole that spans the two sets of legs, and this wrench was used to tighten up these nuts. One of the guys that came to assemble the pool table left this wrench here for us and said that we should leave it out as a conversation starter. And I totally agree with him. I mean, come on, look at it. So this thing definitely needs a home as well. Now, in looking online for some design inspiration, practically every cue rack you see has the cues resting vertically and shelves for the other stuff either in the middle or on the side. The thing about the vertical cue design, it seemed like it was always more trouble than it was worth, because you had to sort of thread the needle every time you needed to put the cue away, which always felt like kind of a hassle to me. I felt like going in a different direction. Literally. I want to make a rack where the cues rest horizontally. Ooh, a non-traditional cue rack design. I'm such a non-conformist. The idea I had was kind of like those barbell racks you see in gyms. Well, that is assuming anybody is allowed to go to gyms anymore. Now, I could just show you the preliminary sketch I did to give you an idea of what I have in mind, but I think a more fun option to show you my grand vision is to time travel into the future and just show you the finished product first before going into how I made it. Now, I don't have a lathe to act as a time machine to pull that off, but I do have this 8-ball. I don't know if it's a magic 8-ball. Here, let me check real quick. Let's see, Mr. and Mrs., Miss Q, magic 8-ball. Here it is. 1 shake per day. All right. 7 days should be plenty. Let's see. Ask again later. By then, it'll be too late. So in lieu of some time-traveling hijinks, I made a mock-up of the rack I had in mind out of cardboard. Appropriately enough, the cardboard here came from one of the boxes of the various pieces that the pool table came in. Now, this design fulfills all the requirements that I had laid out previously. It has a spot for all of the pool cues to go, including the cue guide, whatever it's called. It has a shelf for the brushes in that one box to go on. And underneath that shelf is a spot to hang the 2 racks plus the Mondo wrench. Now, if you're wondering what the pile of seemingly random plumbing fixtures is doing there, that's because of these shelves. Can you tell that I live in Kentucky? These are shelves that were built when the basement was being remodeled. And as you can see, they're big piece of wood with pipes running through them that are painted black. We also have a custom table with giant pipes for legs. We even have a fancy coaster holder that mimics the same style, so we're certainly committed to the aesthetic. So that's what these pipe fittings from earlier were about. They're going to fit under that shelf part like this to act as kind of a hook for the racks, as well as that large wrench. And I also have this cardboard tube up here that's supposed to represent another pipe that goes through the 2 vertical pieces here, but I'll get to that part later. Now, the bottom of these vertical pieces is flat, but it's not going to be that way in the final design. It's actually going to be angled backward right from the bottom of the shelf part by about like 10, 20 degrees maybe, I don't know. It's only flat like this for display purposes because things that don't have a flat bottom tend to fall over. Trust me, I've tried. There's also one more amendment to this design that my dad proposed. He said he wanted to have a spot so that somebody could put their drink on the shelf as well. Now, that in itself isn't a problem. If I need more space, I can just make a wider shelf. But there's a problem when it comes to this design, though. See, the vertical pieces holding up the pool cues have to be exactly 32 inches apart. And that's because the studs in our walls are 16 inches apart. Now, a pool cue rack that's only 16 inches wide sounds kind of silly, especially if it's a horizontal rack like this. And I can't make it too wide because otherwise the cues won't be able to rack. So 32 seemed like an appropriate enough width. Now, when this project is done, the pool rack plus all of the stuff on it isn't going to weigh that much. So it probably isn't too necessary to anchor it to the studs, but I don't want to take any chances. So since I can't alter the length of the shelf on the inside, I'll just have to extend it on the outside of the racks. Now, before I go any further, allow me this brief interlude, just to prime your expectations. There are a lot of tutorial/build videos on the internet made by people who definitely shouldn't be making said videos, aren't formally certified, are inexperienced, or clearly have no idea what they're doing. This is also one of those videos. Now, the vertical and the shelf pieces are going to be made out of this wood, if that wasn't already apparent. This is African mahogany, I think is what it said. I got it mainly just because it matches the same color as the shelves in the basement. Now, it is a bit wide though, so I will have to cut it down. I really only need that shelf to be as wide as this box, and that's 4.5-ish inches, so let's call that an even 5. The tools I'm going to use for this project are just what my dad has available in his garage. Now, space is kind of at a premium in here, so there's no room for a drill press or a table saw or anything like that. That would certainly make this project go a little easier, but I can still make do without it. Now, reducing the width of this is where a table saw would have come in handy. You could totally do this with a circular saw. My dad has a few of those, but I do know this one really neat trick to get the same job done. All right, that worked perfectly. I'm always surprised by how little sawdust gets left over when doing this trick. Now, as you recall from the cardboard model that I made, each of the slots for the cues has this large circle, or half circle, I guess, cut out of the bottom, about 1.5 inches in diameter. And that's so that if you put the cue one way or the other, it'll still fit comfortably in the groove. So both of these wood pieces are going to be symmetrical. So how do you go about making holes that are this big? Well, there are a couple ways you can do that. My dad does have an old set of spade bits. Now, most of the projects he works on are using just 2x4s, so spade bits like these work just fine. But that's the thing, they're just fine, at least for pine. See, I need to drill into hardwood, so these things aren't going to cut it, no matter how sharp they are. And my dad does have a set of what are called auger bits. These are essentially a combination between the spade bits I showed earlier and a normal twist drill. Now, you'll notice there's a tapered screw on the end of the bit here, and that's supposed to drive into whatever material you're trying to drill into. And that sort of pulls the bit along, so it makes it a little bit easier to drill in. But again, that's only if the wood you're drilling into is soft enough, and that definitely isn't going to work in hardwood. So then enter the fastener bit, the Forester bit, the Forstner bit. Forstner bits are specifically designed with large, precise holes in mind. You can see on the edge of the cutting head on this bit, there are these sawtooth blades for defining the edge of the hole you're cutting. There are two flat cutting edges in the middle that are hogging out the majority of the wood, and a spike in the middle for alignment. Now, you don't actually need a pilot hole or to gradually increase drill bit sizes to get larger holes with Forstner bits, because they can remove all of the material in the hole on their own. Looking at a side profile of the cutting edge of the Forstner bit, you can see there's a lot more meat going in the direction of the cut, as opposed to spade and auger bits, where the tip of the cutting edge doesn't really have a lot of support to drill into hardwood. You also have a beefier shank for going into the chuck, 3/8 inch instead of the usual 1/4 inch. They could definitely take a lot more torque. Definitely better suited for drilling large holes in hardwood. Actually, you know what? Forget hypotheticals. Why don't I just show you what happens when you try to use these bits in hardwood? Good grief, that was a bear. Spade bit actually fared better than I was expecting, although this did take a while. And the surface finish is a little bit chowdery, but you might be able to recover that with sandpaper. The auger bit, on the other hand, was a mess. Hopefully that demonstrates what I was trying to explain earlier. I mean, in my head it made sense, but, well, I have an art degree, not an engineering degree. Now, you'll probably notice with all the gunk on the edge here that this bit has already been used, and that's because I used it on this project. This is a BB gun rack I made for my dad. He needed one of these because he has grandkids that are getting tall enough to reach off of shelves. Now, I bought those Forstner bits specifically for this project because I made this out of rosewood, and rosewood is quite literally an order of magnitude harder. I used it to cut out the little notch for the stand part, just drilled through and then just cut it off halfway. And that's essentially what I'm going to do for the pool cue rack. So I at least sort of have an idea of what I'm doing. Now, you can technically use these with a hand drill, given that your chuck is large enough to accept that shank. However, Forstner bits are really meant to be used in a drill press, because these bits are meant for precise holes. Again, I don't have a drill press, so woe is me. So if you do tend to use these just handheld, just make sure that you have a very steady hand, because any deviation is gonna ruin the hole. I mean, that's what I did on the BB gun rack, so you've seen the results yourself. My dad does have this, which is this old drill that has these guides on it for drilling straight into wood, but I mean, it's mostly made of plastic, so who knows how well it works. But if I'm trying to get precise holes, this is the best I've got. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna mark off where these holes need to go, and then use this drill guide to help make the holes. I'm also keeping the two pieces clamped together so I can do all these cuts at once. That way, well, in theory, these pieces should be symmetrical. One note about cutting into wood is that if you have nicer wood that you're drilling into, make sure to put this sacrificial piece of wood underneath. That way when you drill into your good piece and you hit the bottom, you don't get blowout. I especially want to do that for this piece because I want to maintain the crisp edges. Well, the drill guide worked fairly well, but as you can see, the drill itself sucks, for lack of a better term. It's not nearly powerful enough to get through mahogany. But as you can see, it's leaving a really nice crisp edge, so proof of concept that Forstner bits are just superior. Now, unfortunately, that drill guide only goes with that one drill. It can't fit on anything else that's in my dad's garage, so that's a shame, but he does have more powerful drills, so I'll have to use one of those to... So that's good. I think it was still a good idea to use that drill guide just so I can get a good start and make sure that I'm going straight down. But for the rest of the drilling, I'll probably just resort to the more powerful drill again. 1 hole down, 6 more. All right, well, I've got all the holes drilled, except for one small problem. The holes on the bottom piece, well, this is what you get when you don't use a drill press. I was kind of afraid that this was gonna happen. I was kind of drilling through a lot of wood, so I knew a little bit of run out was inevitable. So I figured maybe if it ran out like a 1/16 of an inch, then I'd call that acceptable. But this is way too much. But it's not the end of the world. I've got a lot of other wood to work with, so I'll just cut another piece in. All right, that's all done. This is the second board I cut. Now, I don't know if you can see that, but I marked off where the holes are supposed to go on both sides. And then I drilled halfway through on both sides. That way I make sure it's mostly straight at least. That also helps prevent you getting blowout on both sides, so that way you don't have as much sanding to do. I probably should have done the drilling from both sides thing to begin with, but you know, hindsight is the current year. One note to mention about Forstner bits. These things get really, really hot. And I guess that goes for the same for all drill bits in general. But that's especially true for Forstner bits because they have these flat sides on the edge, which in turn means there's a lot of surface area rubbing against the inside of the holes, which in turn causes a lot of friction, and yada yada yada, it gets hot. So if you're using these, make sure to occasionally let the bit cool down. Or you can dunk it in some water if you're, you know, a little impatient like I am. Because if you start seeing burn marks on the inside of the holes, or if you're seeing smoke or smelling smoke, that's a bad sign. So now I gotta cut out the notches that make up the racks. I got that piece that I messed up earlier in the back, just so I don't get any blowout on the edges here. Now you can tell I didn't take that cut all the way to the line. That's just to give me a little bit of breathing room when I go to sand it down, and maybe I'll use some chisels just to get it right to the sort of the tangent of the circle, if you will. All right, let's talk about actually getting these 3 pieces to attach to each other. As you recall from the cardboard model, these vertical pieces extend just a tiny bit below the shelf part, and it's angled backwards, so this part wouldn't show. Now, if this were the final design where the shelf meets with the vertical part, I would have just routed out a small channel for this shelf to slot into, just like I did with the BB gun rack. But remember, this shelf is actually extending out this way. Now I could just mill another slot on both sides and stick them that way. That'd certainly be easy enough. I don't think that would necessarily look as good. See, I want the vertical piece to sort of look uninterrupted as it's just sort of like passing through. But the thing is, I want this shelf part as it extends past the vertical to be one piece if at all possible, just for structural reasons. So this longer shelf piece, I don't want to destroy it any more than I need to. So this is what I came up with. I'm going to cut out 2 slots so that the vertical and horizontal piece can slide into each other. Now most of the material I'm going to cut out with the chop saw, but to bring everything to final dimension, I'm going to use my dad's handheld router. I'd recommend against using a 2x4 for this, simply because these aren't most dimensionally accurate, as any trip to Home Depot will surely indicate. So make sure you use a piece that you know is dimensionally straight. Now, one thing to note with these routers is that they're extremely grippy, or at least this bit is. And even this tiny handheld battery-operated one is a lot more powerful than you would expect. It can get away from you sometimes. So just take everything slow, make sure you have a strong grip, clamp everything down as tight as you can so that nothing moves on you. And hopefully you leave with all the fingers that you started with. One quick tip if you're looking to try to get an accurate slot here, when you're clamping on either side of where the slot is that you're going to route out, use one of the scrap pieces of wood of the same dimension and clamp up to that board. I probably want to go a little bit tighter fit than that, so probably I'll just have to adjust that. My apologies, but there's a lot of stuff that just happened that you didn't get to see. But long story short, I screwed up. When I initially routed out this slot the first time, the first pass, it was actually a perfect fit for that scrap piece of wood that I had. But when I went to test it on the actual shelf piece that I had already cut, it was way too tight. Like almost splitting the wood tight. So I had to make another very, very slight skim pass. When I went to make that second pass, I actually had this thing upside down when I was checking the fit, and I was too lazy to turn it around, so I was actually routing it from underneath rather than on top like you're supposed to. And yada yada yada. The fit is now way too loose. So I had to start over. So that's what I did off screen. Now that other piece that I had already cut was perfectly fine, so all I did to make the second one was rough cut the second piece just like I did the first, but I left it just slightly oversized. That way I could just come with the router, making extra sure that I was staying on top, not on the bottom, and route out right up to the line. I'm sure there are plenty of woodworking professionals watching this that are yelling at your computer and or cell phone screens about how this isn't how you should do any of this. But remember what I said back here? You can't say I didn't warn you. So take everything I say with a heavy pinch of salt, and maybe a dash of paprika. In my mind, normally a project like this would only take about a day or so to complete. But because I have to be my own Roger Deakins, this is taking like a week to finish instead of just a day, which is why I had to finish that second piece off screen. That second piece really only took me like 20 minutes. Now again, this is probably something I should have just done to begin with, but also again, hindsight is MMXX. And this is actually starting to look like something. The fit here is really good. It's really nice and tight. You notice I haven't hammered it all the way in because it's really, really tight right now. But as I continue to sand the surface of these down, which I need to do anyway, the fit of that will improve. It only took me 10 tries, but it worked out. So now we need to focus on this hole that the pipe is going to go through. My plan with this pipe is to have 2 couplers on either side, and using a cap with a small nipple, screw through on either side of the hole here and kind of clamp down on the wood. I don't want to actually clamp down too hard because I don't want it to mar the surface. But again, that's the idea. But there's just one small problem with this. The space between these vertical pieces needs to be exactly 31-ish inches. If I put 2 couplers on this off-the-shelf 30-inch pipe and tighten them down as far as they'll go, then this ends up being almost exactly 32-ish inches. So I'm gonna need to modify this. Luckily, my dad has a bench grinder, so what I'm gonna do is grind off the threads on the pipe until the coupler slips through, and then just JB weld everything together. Be careful because this stuff will get toasty. I'm also gonna grind out the internal threads on one side of these couplers. Pro tip when it comes to grinding metal, make sure to sweep away the sawdust from all the wood that you were working on earlier. Now some of you watching are probably wondering why I did it this way. Because this pipe is just an off-the-shelf one, and I could have asked one of the employees at Home Depot to just cut that to length and then cut the threads to whatever I needed, instead of having to do all this grinding. But there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that I needed a fairly specific length that I didn't actually know what I was going to be at the time. If I knew they were going to be 32 inches apart, then I knew the pipe and coupler combo would need to be 31 inches to make up the gap. But because these are slightly under 1 inch, that length is going to be a little bit longer than that. And having some poor Home Depot employee cater to my whims was surely going to be a nightmare for them. Going back and forth with the length and the cut and make sure the threads twisted to just the exact right length that I didn't know what I was going to need at the time. So yeah, that would have been kind of a hassle. The other reason that I didn't do it the other way was because I didn't realize that was an option until after I had already done all this. Now all I'm going to do to attach the shelf part to the rail part is just a countersunk screw going in at an angle. There's no wood glue here holding anything together. Since this part will be the top of the shelf, I want to make sure that these two edges are as flush as possible. So that screw going in will sort of clamp the pieces together and will sort of make up for any slop that I had when I was routing it. You can see right here, there's a tiny gap, but that's not going to matter because that's going to be on the bottom and on the wall, so you won't see it. Well, except for you watching this. I might do the trick where I use some of the sawdust from the wood and mix it with some wood glue to fill any gaps or cracks or anything like that, but luckily for me I don't have, well, except maybe for here. I can feel your eyes judging my craftsmanship. Did anybody tell you it's not polite to stay? The way I'm going to attach this to the wall is with some floating shelf brackets. When I drill the hole for these, I just need to make sure I don't go through a spot where it'll go through one of the cutouts for the rack. Now I need to mill out a slot to fit the wall-mounted part of the bracket. It needs to go deep enough to at least cover the thickness of the bracket and however far a screw head protrudes. And that's where Forstner bits come in handy. And then just carve out the rest with a nice sharp chisel. Now this doesn't look very pretty, but it's going to be covered up by the wall, so it doesn't really need to be. Now with these brackets, you don't want the fit to be too tight like this. Like I can't push it down just with my own hand force anymore. Now if I hammered it in, then it would go in, but then I'd never be able to take it out. You also don't want it to be too loose, otherwise it'll rattle and you won't have a very secure connection on the wall. Now the drill bit I was using isn't exactly the same diameter. It's like just a hair under. Just to widen it, you can wiggle it around a little bit in the hole just to make it wide enough to accept this. But there's always going to be that tiny little bit at the very bottom that won't exactly be the right diameter. Now one thing you can do to get the fit of this just right, heat the end up really, really hot, and then burn your way through the bottom ½ inch or so. Obviously you don't want it to get hot enough that it'll actually catch it on fire, but just enough to get that last ½ inch or so that it's a snug fit. But again, if you're gonna do this, be careful. 1 down, 3 to go. All right, that went pretty well. And I evidently trapped myself in here. Now that's done, there's really not much else to do. Though all that work has kind of left me parched, so I'm gonna stop for a drink real quick. Oh, no. I'm not making that mistake again. What? How? It has a lid. Much better. Now I didn't come back to the basement to get a drink, although that was nice. I actually came back to talk about matching the finish on these shelves. And this mahogany, when you wet it down or put whatever finish on, it matches the color of the shelf pretty good. It has a little bit more red in it, but it's not too far off. Now I wanted to preserve the more natural look of the wood without affecting the color that much. There are a couple of popular ways that I've seen to do that. One was to melt together linseed oil and beeswax and form it into sort of a paste-like consistency, and then rub it on to whatever wood you're using. But I accidentally stumbled upon a finish that I think cuts out a couple of steps there. And you might already have some of this in your cupboard. Yep, just good old Vaseline was all I used for this. Now this stuff is kind of old. You can tell how yellow it is, so maybe that yellowness did affect the color of this, but any fresh stuff isn't going to do it as much, I guess. And that's what I did on this scrap piece of the mahogany here. You can see kind of a difference in what the color looks like from here and back here. So it doesn't really add any color like a stain would, it just enhances whatever color is naturally in the wood. Since this is already at a paste-like consistency, all you do is just rub it down really thick, let it soak for a while, like half hour to an hour maybe, and then just wipe off as much of it as you can and sort of buff it, just so you get a nice sheen. One thing I suggest you do before applying the petroleum jelly is to clean the surface with some isopropyl alcohol, just to get rid of any dust or anything like that, because you always want to make sure that you're clean before you rub Vaseline all over your hardwood. Now, I know this might be an unconventional finish, but you all have actually seen this before. I used that same finish on the rosewood that I used for the BB gun rack. Now, making the pool cue rack out of this rosewood would have been really nice, but I decided not to for reasons. Because petroleum jelly has such a low melting point, if you need to penetrate deeper into very dense wood like this rosewood here, that's an option as well. All right, I think that's all I need to say about the finish. Let's go ahead and get this wrapped up and... Well, mistake number whatever this is. I took the rack apart so I could do the finish, but yeah, I dropped it. And so, of course, it broke along the grain on the weakest point right here at the thinnest spot. Luckily, it was a really clean break. There weren't any splinters or anything anywhere, so there's no gaps. So at least it makes gluing it back together fairly easy.
Flawless victory.
A couple of things I want to show you since I didn't film the final steps to finish the rack, as there wasn't really anything that exciting to see. I only sanded the wood down to 240 grit before applying the petroleum jelly. I might spray some kind of poly finish on this later, but I'm curious to see how Vaseline holds up long term. It's been about a couple months now, so far so good. Also, one thing to note is the color difference that you see between these two pieces. This one's significantly darker and redder than the shelf part. But all of these pieces were cut from the same slab of wood. Now, I don't really care about this color mismatch for this project, but that's something for you to keep in mind if you plan on doing something like this. I spray painted the pipes with a few coats of flat black and then a few coats of a clear matte finish, although it does look shiny just because I have a spotlight on it right now. And then I just mounted them with 4 short screws, just making sure I didn't poke through the top of the shelf. 4 screws is pretty overkill. These pipes really only need 2, but I felt like being a completist. One thing to note about these pipes, when you look at the whole rack dead on, you'll notice the pipes aren't evenly spaced. That's because the ball racks and the wrench are all different sizes, so while the pipes aren't mathematically evenly spaced, everything looks visually evenly spaced. And mounting this whole rack to the wall was pretty simple too. Just used a stud finder, mounted the brackets to the studs, and then just slid the rack on. Again, the fit is really snug, but not so snug that I wouldn't be able to take this off the wall if I needed to move it. Well, I'm happy with how this project turned out. Hope you all are too, and thanks for watching. Hold on there, partner. I haven't dismissed you yet. Let me explain myself a bit here. This whole video was sort of an experiment for me. I got this idea to start a video series where I pay homage to certain YouTubers / creators with unique visual styles by emulating their style in a video while also putting my own spin into it, and of course plugging their channels at the end as well. I already have ideas of other internetainers I'd like to make videos about. If you couldn't tell from the title of this video, I'm emulating the style of a guy called This Old Tony. One of his YouTube commenters said that his is a dad joke channel with a machining problem. And there's probably no better description than that. Of all the machining / DIY channels out there, his is probably my favorite. Not only for his humor and visual style, but also because you'll probably actually learn something along the way. Now, the majority of the videos he makes won't apply to me because I doubt I will ever own a lathe in my lifetime. But during this very project, I had to sharpen some drill bits, and I knew how to do that from one of his videos. So those of you who know This Old Tony probably picked up on all the little TOT signatures I showcased. The sweatshirt that I should have thrown out a decade ago and all. I might make a separate video going into a more thorough breakdown / analysis of This Old Tony's visual style and why I chose him over other equally entertaining DIY channels. I don't know. Let me know if you'd want to see something like that. Now, for those of you subscribed to me, all 70 of you, don't worry, he'll still make the My Worst Critic videos. This is just him branching out a bit. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, then what are you doing with your life? But if you don't know who This Old Tony is and you liked this video, then you'll definitely love his. So go over to his channel and subscribe because he definitely deserves it. And as always, thanks for watching.